Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
It is Wednesday night at 8 o'clock on the East Coast, and you know what that means. Good evening and welcome to episode number 6 of Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. Got a great show tonight, and I'm glad you're here with us. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in the middle of North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina. So glad you're with us tonight. We've got a lot to get to. We will head down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where we will talk about what Hurricane Barry did to the state last weekend. And then we head up to Hagerstown, Maryland, where we will talk to one of the longest tenured meteorologists on the East Coast. For us here in Raleigh today, it was all about the heat. 98 degrees. It was our hottest day of the year. So hopefully you found a way to stay cool wherever you're watching from tonight. If there's anything you would like to know or subjects that you would like us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, remember this email. Send it, SENDIT, at CBS17.com. Send it at CBS17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, so we'd love to hear from you. We've got a great group of meteorologists tonight. I need to scooch over just a bit so everyone can see. So that's me. You can find me at Weather Wes Hohenstein, at Weather Wes on Twitter, Weather Wes Hohenstein on Facebook. We're going to go down and talk to Jesse Gunkel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He's meteorologist Jesse Gunkel on Facebook. And then we're going to head up to Hagerstown and talk to a couple of their meteorologists, their weather team. You know, they've got an interesting dilemma there around the mid-Atlantic at Hagerstown with all the big cities and how they handle big weather. So we'll talk about that. But right now, let's kind of talk about what's going on. You know, since Barry made landfall over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and it dropped a whole bunch of rain. I mean, the tropics have kind of been quiet. You know, usually we expect that. June and July, there's usually not a lot that's going on. And we look at the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, we look around the Bahamas to see where most things form this time of year. And with the exception of a blip on the satellite there you see as we rotate through, there's not a whole lot going on. Now, this time of year, we don't quite look out here in the open waters of the Atlantic yet because the climatology tells us that there's just not a lot that develops there yet. And there are several reasons around that. Some of it has to do with some Saharan dust coming off the coast of Africa. That remains active. And when that's active, the tropics are not active. So where do we look this time of year? So here we are, middle of July. Storms normally form, again, not out here, but everywhere you see a dot, that's where we generally see storms form. Whether depression, storm, or hurricane, look where all the dots are. They're in the Gulf of Mexico, they're off the southeast coast, in around the Bahamas, and they're in parts of the Caribbean, maybe far western parts of the Atlantic, just outside the Caribbean. So this is where we'll watch. And there's really nothing going on in those spots. So there's nothing really to be concerned with at this point. But as we go throughout the next several months, things will really start to get busy. We refer to this graph a lot, and I know you've been out of school long enough, you don't want to talk about graphs, but this does a great job of showing us when things get really active. It's a simple graph. The red represents all hurricane and tropical storms over the years. The yellow is hurricanes only. And you can see as we go throughout the year, things ramp up. The tropical season reaches its peak right there on September 10th. So we are still way before that. We're kind of in that lull before things really get started. And a lot of times you might hear meteorologists say, and I know I've been known to say it, things really don't get started. The season really doesn't start until after August 1st. Look at these statistics from our good friend Dr. Phil Klossbach at Colorado State University, best hurricane guy in the world, I think. Tropical storms, 84% of our tropical storms form after August 1st. 91% of our hurricanes throughout history form after August 1st. 95% of major hurricanes form after August 1st. So things really haven't gotten started yet. I think we all have known that. The exception being what's going on in Louisiana. So far this year, we've checked Andrea, we've checked Barry, which was a Category 1 hurricane off our list. Next up in the Atlantic side, Chantal, Dorian, Aaron, Fernand, and Gabrielle. There is the entire list that you can take a look at right now. So let's take a look at what's going on right now in South Louisiana. Here is a live look at Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Usually this time of night down there, we have to have our producers check this camera to make sure it is family friendly. If you've never been to Bourbon Street after dark, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that is just down the road from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and that is where WVLE NBC 33 Chief Meteorologist Jesse Gunkel is. Jesse, we all monitored Barry last week. You guys had a front row seat. I'd like to know how things are going now, and tell me a little bit about what you guys went through over the weekend with Barry.
Well, Wes, first of all, thank you for having me on this show. And yes, I finally got my first real round of sleep overnight. It's been kind of one of those long stretch where you got to do all that preparation prior to the storm making landfall, and then you got to wait for landfall, and then you got to see exactly what happens in these type of situations. Does the damage, does the weather overall continue to be a big time factor for our local market? Now again, it may not have been the biggest of storms, but we had over 100 power outages throughout the entire state. Still some areas kind of reeling with that situation. Again, still a lot of people without power at this point, mainly near the coast at this point. But the main thing is it's hot and it's extremely humid. That same heat that you guys are currently dealing with, we're dealing with it here. And that's obviously typical for us here in South Louisiana. Also, again, we had to deal with, again, a little bit of storm surge out there with this system. I just want to point out that this was a very odd system to start out with. It started out, and you see big picture here, just around the Tennessee Valley. Then it kind of marched itself across Georgia. Then there was some hope. The National Hurricane Center said, hey, this looks like we could be potentially seeing something entering the Gulf of Mexico, and that's not going to stay out there for too long before moving back inland. And at times, it looked like the model runs were pretty accurate. I think overall, kind of looking at the European model, which everybody talks about, the forecast was right. Even intensity-wise, it did get up to a Category 1 hurricane just before landfall, and that was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, and that was around Intracoastal City, Louisiana, which sits just right here, just a little bit from your old stomping grounds, which is over in Lafayette. Obviously, it made its way through the area as a Category 1 storm. I think our peak wind gusts were sitting around 90 miles per hour at its max, and that was just out in the Gulf of Mexico. But again, since it was a very odd beginning, most of this storm was very lopsided throughout its entire life. And when we saw those original estimates out there, that was the alarming part. Again, the track, we knew where it was going to go. Somewhere between Texas and Louisiana, we saw that probably within 5 to 6 days out. However, again, it was the rainfall totals that were quite alarming across most areas. And as you see big picture here, then that system drove through the state and eventually hooked its way back, and now starting to slide up towards the northeast, providing a little bit of rainfall there. So some lingering showers. We're finally getting out of those storms as we speak today. Now here again is that original estimate, and you see that bullseye across much of our viewing area here down in southeastern Louisiana. That was between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and I think the biggest concern for a lot of areas, just 5 weeks ago, we had 10 inches of rainfall. A lot of areas have seen a lot of rain over the last couple of months. New Orleans had some heavy rainfall 2 days prior to landfall, where they even had some, if you've seen the footage, you saw that, again, there was flooding all throughout the city of New Orleans, and that the Mississippi River, the highest it's been in over 100 years, obviously, again, over 250 days, would you believe it, that we've actually been above flood stage on the Mississippi River. So that was the scariest part about this system, was the fact that we could see anywhere from 10 to 20, locally up to about 25 inches of rainfall. And then that's all on top of all of our rivers and streams being well above flood stage at this point. So that's obviously never a good combination. And that's why a lot of people were on high alert over the next couple of days as that system arrived. And luckily for us, it didn't pan out. What happened was we had a lot of dry air kind of in the mix on the northern side of the system, and that kept all the rain a little bit further south. It also kind of kept the system from completely and rapidly intensifying overnight, and therefore, as you see here, again, those rain totals, this is exactly what happened, and this is just radar estimates, just kind of give you the big picture out there. We did have some heavy rain bands, but it took about 24 hours almost, well, I would say maybe about 18 hours before that heavy rain arrived into the capital area, before, again, Barry even made landfall. So it made landfall. We saw the rain on Sunday going into Monday, and that's where it got pretty nasty for us. In fact, that's when we had some isolated tornadoes kind of across the area. We had probably about, I would say about 10, maybe 11 tornado warnings across the area that quickly popped up by late Sunday morning going into the afternoon hours. And you can see really here, it was all where those rain bands set up. As you see, a lot of heavy rainfall. There were some areas that got up to about, if you can see it in the white and blue, up to about 14 to 16 inches of rainfall. But luckily it wasn't for southeastern Louisiana. Notice the mountains, they kind of missed the path a little bit further southeast on the way down to about New Orleans at this point. So as you see here, we've got heavy rainfall in pockets, and I think the biggest wave was right around here. Officially at the airport, we had over 8 inches of rainfall in Denham Springs, which sits just a slightly further east, and you can see here just about 9 to 10 inches of overall rainfall. And that was the same area that was impacted by a tornado. A lot of that heavy rainfall was even along the coast. So what we got from all these models long range was the fact that the track was pretty good. The intensity was right on at a Category 1 storm at landfall. However, the rain estimates were a little bit off with this system, but I don't think anybody's complaining because, again, you just want to be prepared in this type of situation.
Yeah, Jesse, I'm glad you guys didn't get that more than 20 inches of rain. We were watching that here in North Carolina. But I follow you on social media, and it seems like all you were talking about over the weekend was tornadoes. You guys had a lot of tornado warnings to deal with, right?
Yeah, again, we saw those with those feeder bands. A lot of those tornadoes really kind of sparked not the day of landfall, but it was the day after. So not Saturday, but Sunday. And it started out early in the morning throughout the entire afternoon. And then we kind of shifted to flash flood warnings. It was because there were a couple bands out there, and you can see one of those bands that kind of set up across the area. It did not budge. That rain was in place for about 6 to 8 hours before we even saw a little bit of a break here from all of that rainfall. And again, I do want to point out too, besides again the tornadoes, we did have some wind damage reports out here. We did have some tropical storm force winds a little bit further inland. So again, we had a lot of power outages across the area, a lot of trees down, a lot of stoplights out because of this system across the area. So I think, again, we did have some wind concerns out there, but most of it was that rainfall, and luckily we did not see it because the big concern also was, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, we had that massive flooding event. That was 2016, and that's where a lot of areas here got up to about 36 inches of rainfall. That's right, 36 inches of rainfall in about a 2 to 3 day span. And when they originally came out with some of these estimates, I'll jump back to where they were looking at some of these totals. They were putting river stages above that record amount. And that's when everybody was at the point where, do I have to leave my house now and immediately get out of town, grab my stuff and go? Because, yeah, if we had over 36 inches of rainfall in some spots, yeah, they were looking at river crests in a lot of areas that was, again, where we saw massive water across our entire viewing area. The entire area was actually flooded. And that was one of the things that they were really going to watch closely as we made our way forward. Now, the good news is because the rain estimates didn't pan out, our overall river stage has dropped very quickly across the area.
So river stayed down. This happened over the weekend. I'm curious, was life pretty much back to normal on Monday? I mean, people back to work?
Well, we still had some heavy rainfall in a lot of spots on Monday. Yeah, but people were back to work, and by the time we got to Tuesday, things kind of shaped up. We got back to sunshine, and it got very hot and humid out here. So I've actually kind of been focusing the attention now on if you don't have power, you don't have AC, or you don't have fans to keep you cool, you got to think about heat exhaustion out there because now it's recovery efforts for especially those residents who live along the coast.
Right, and you mentioned at the beginning, and speaking of exhaustion, what was going on at the TV station? I mean, how do you guys handle? I know here, we are working 12 on and 12 off. I mean, how was your weekend like, and what were the reporters and anchors? What's going on to kind of inside the walls of the TV station?
Well, again, for us, again, it was a different situation too, because this is the time of year we kind of ramp ourselves up for late August and September, because usually for us that's our peak too, because we see Katrina, Rita, Harvey, you name all the big ones, have usually ended up in the last 2 weeks of August or the first 2 weeks of September. So in fact, we actually had part of our team on vacation, so that was part of the concern out there. And as you notice, that kind of caught a lot of people off guard because, again, we typically don't see hurricanes this early in the season here. In fact, it's only been the 4th hurricane in recorded history to make landfall in Louisiana, even though this has been our 50th hurricane so far since they've started recording hurricanes across much of the United States. So we get our fair share of hurricanes out here. However, this was the only fourth one in the month of July.
Wow.
So again, we had a lot of people on vacation, and that was one of our biggest concerns out there. How are we going to cover this storm? So we had to do rotating shifts, and again, we were 12 on, 12 off. Along with, again, doing press conferences and doing radio and everything else in between. So we kind of laid it out. We had new people here too. So we kind of, you know, you have to kind of lay it all into the mix. So we had to do, again, the shift work. We had people everywhere kind of taking their turns when necessary, kind of battling a storm like this.
Well, excellent job in covering it. And yes, as you mentioned, my first job after college many, many years ago was right down the road in Lafayette, Louisiana. So I'll make a deal with you. I will send you some great North Carolina barbecue if you rustle up some crawfish for me and send them up here to Raleigh.
Deal.
Awesome. Well, that is Jesse
that's a
Gunkel.
deal. So.
Perfect. Jesse, he is down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Next time you find yourself down there, check him out on NBC 33. You can also find him on meteorologist Jesse Gunkel on Facebook. All right, so let's look back one more time. You know, if you haven't been following it, I know a lot of you were off during the 4th of July. Here was that track Barry took. You could trace the origins of this the day after the 4th of July over Missouri as a cluster of thunderstorms and upper-level disturbance. A couple days after that, the National Hurricane Center started picking up on it when it moved over Tennessee and northern parts of the South on the 6th and 7th of July. So here is the National Hurricane Center saying, hey, this thing over Missouri could become a tropical threat. I mean, how strange does that sound? But that's exactly what they were onto. So from there, the 7th and 9th and the 10th of July, it started to move down to Florida, got out over the warm Gulf of Mexico, blew up into a Category 1 hurricane, moved up through Louisiana, through Arkansas, back over Missouri 11 days later on July 16th. And today, the 17th of July, a little more, almost 2 weeks after it first came together over Missouri, it's over Ohio, and now it could bring us some better rain chances here in North Carolina tomorrow. Quite an amazing track, and I like pointing out the fact that the National Hurricane Center was on top of it because they don't always get the best publicity if they miss a forecast, but boy, they were all over this. So a great job from the men and women who keep an eye on the tropics for us at the National Hurricane Center. And you heard Jesse talk about it. It was a Category 1. They had a lot of flooding problems, a lot of power outages. I always like to point out the fact and remind everyone that a Category 1 hurricane is a hurricane, and it means serious business. Since 2010, when just a Category 1 hurricane has made landfall in the United States, it has been responsible for 175 deaths, more than $103 billion in damage. That's just Category 1 hurricanes. So they're the real deal. They mean business. And luckily right now we don't have anything we're worried about on our side of the United States, in the Atlantic Ocean. Different story in the Pacific Ocean. There's actually two things that they're keeping an eye on. Again, just to kind of reorientate yourself, there's Mexico, there's Central America, United States up here. So we're over here on the other side. Hawaii, if I could come all the way over here, is all the way on the far left side of your screen. There's actually two systems kind of right along this intertropical convergence zone in the Pacific side that are starting to flare up that are warranting a 30% chance of development and possibly a 40% chance of development. So things are active on the Pacific side. They usually get going a little sooner than the Atlantic side, and they've actually had 1, 2, 3 storms already, including Barbara, which became a Cat 4. A lot happens over there in the Pacific side that we don't often hear about here in the United States, but they've made it through Alvin, Barbara, and Cosme. Next up on their list, Delilah, Eric, Flossie, and Gil. And just to remind everyone, a Category 4 hurricane, again, that was a monster. That was a major hurricane, 130 to 156 mile per hour winds. So again, busy over on the Pacific side, not so much on the Atlantic side right now. But let's stay over here on the East Coast for our next guest. Here's a live look up in Ocean City, Maryland. Tonight, we are going to visit with Scott Sumner and Lou Scally from WDVM in Hagerstown, Maryland. Guys, you are right off the major pipeline of D.C. and Baltimore and Philadelphia. I mean, big, major populations. How do you guys handle all those major cities when you're handling major hurricanes coming on the East Coast?
Well, good evening, Wes. We want to thank you for having us on board tonight. This is a great pleasure to be on the Nexstar Network. We take in a rather large geographic area here, all the way from the mountains of far western Maryland down to the Atlantic Ocean, which is about 175 miles away. We also cover south central PA, the panhandle of West Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the metropolitan D.C. area. So, Scott, we got a lot of real estate.
And I'm learning that because I'm fairly new to this team here. Lou has been a staple of this station for many years, and Lou, I see you have some notes here. Usually this far north, we don't get direct hits; we get indirect hits.
That's right.
What have you experienced?
Well, we've had several incidences where we've had major players, and I think the biggest one that sticks with my mind was Hurricane Agnes, which actually was a tropical storm by the time it made it into our area, but it wreaked havoc not only in this area but all across the northeastern United States, including the very important Chesapeake Bay, which is full of those great Maryland blue crabs and oysters, and that really set that industry upside down for a couple of years from the effects of just one tropical storm. Now, as far as Barry is concerned here today, we really didn't have a whole lot of action. We picked up a little bit more than a half inch of rain around here, and a little bit of the tropical DNA was in with that rain that fell today. But for the most part, we skated through this one. But our season hasn't even started in earnest yet, because September technically is our month. That's the big month around here.
That's right. Yeah. Once we get into September, boy, all hands on deck at this point in time. At that point in time for that particular month, and I was kind of born up in the area up here in the Northeast, New Jersey, raised, and then I moved down south, and I've been down south for about 15 years. I moved around, and one of the places I ended up before I got here was Savannah, and as Lou knows, and Savannah had been void of any sort of major tropical system, hurricane. That's because it formed a little niche. As you look at the map, the topography of it is much further inland. If you look at the Outer Banks and then go south of the Outer Banks and then go west, we're a good 150 to 200 miles west of there. So systems are usually close enough and don't really impact much. So that's all I had heard when I was down there. But sure enough, I arrived and we had Hurricane Matthew. And I got to tell you, Matthew was an interesting case. It was the first Category 5 Atlantic hurricane since Felix back in 2007 to actually make some sort of impact in and around that area. And it was interesting. Wes, you talked about some 12-hour on and off shifts. We had the same sort of thing. And it was actually the 13th named storm, Matthew was, 5th hurricane and the 2nd major hurricane that particular season, which, as you well know, Lou, was a very busy season. And it was interesting to see, as the system got close, we were all like, well, maybe too far to the west, to the east, I should say, we won't really get any impacts. But then we saw the track, and it got a little closer and closer towards us. And we started to ramp it up a little. We got a little concerned. We did see actually stronger ones, funny enough, on the west side as the storm passed us than we did as the storm came up and hugged the coastline. But my experiences have been, brushing with hurricanes and brushing with tropical systems, nothing direct.
Well, we like to think of Barry today as our dress rehearsal here for what is going to be a busy season. I did take a look at some of the statistics. In the last 70 years, right here in the great state of Maryland, we've had 121 hurricanes, tropical storms, tropical depressions that have impacted this area. So even though we are inland 175 miles, we still get an effect of these storms quite a bit. We have the great Potomac River that runs from far western Maryland all the way down to the nation's capital. That many times is a victim of flooding because of tropical moisture. We also have the Chesapeake Bay, which we mentioned, and that also is affected by these tropical events. Not to mention the very valuable shoreline at Ocean City, one of the biggest tourist attractions here in the region, both for not only Maryland, but D.C., Virginia, and even in Delaware. Folks come to Ocean City, Maryland, and many times these storms have peeled the beach right off the boardwalk, and they've had to rebuild it. It's amazing how they get the beach replenishment and get things back together in time for the season. So this is our season to keep an eye on the sky and an eye on the National Hurricane Center, and we certainly enjoy bringing the information to our viewers out there across this area. Again, our geographical area is all the way from western Maryland down to the metropolitan Washington area, south central PA, the panhandle of West Virginia, and a good portion of northern Virginia. And that is quite an area of population. We have the Shenandoah River, the Potomac River, and all these other great tributaries. So all of them are impacted by this tropical weather.
Yeah, and Lou, I have to ask you, in your experiences here, what have been maybe the one experience where the flooding stood out the most to you?
Well, before I got in the business, Agnes, in '72, we had water that people had not seen. It was the worst flooding in 36 years at that time. We've had others close to it, but Agnes certainly held the benchmark for flooding. It also held the record for the number of fatalities, unfortunately. Also, that was before we had the Turnaround, Don't Drown campaign, and a lot of folks got lost in waters from Agnes. So it's an interesting season coming up, and of course we have all the tools. Our Barron's weather system, we're all ready to go, and we got a good team here at WDVM. So we're looking forward to serving our viewership.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more, Lou. And as a last note from me, basically, people ask me, how do you get into the industry? What made you get interested? Well, I have to say one little aspect was it that I had to be about 15 or 16, and we had Hurricane Gloria roaring up the Atlantic, heading towards heading towards Long Island, and I was petrified of that. And that kind of is one of those weather instances that comes to my mind anyway. That kind of I think back on and said, well, maybe that had a little impact into why I got into weather to begin with.
Well, I tell you, it's a great business, and we keep people safe, and a lot of, I think most people follow the advice from National Hurricane Center, evacuate and get away from these storms, and we have a pretty good system all through the South, down through Savannah, and all through the Carolinas. They have it rehearsed as far as escape routes away from the beach areas, and here in Maryland also we have our escape plans, so we're looking forward to a quiet season, but we know in our heart that that's not going to happen. Big story here, by the way, aside from tropical moisture, we picked up a little less than an inch of rain here today. We needed that because we're looking for a tropical heat wave here with temperatures close to 100 degrees plus and heat indices up to 105, 110s. So it's going to be a hot couple of days here in the greater WDVM viewing area.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. And Scott and Lou, I want to ask you this. Great statistic. I didn't realize more than 100 storms over the years have impacted you guys in the tropical situation. So what's a bigger deal up there? Is it this time of year with the tropics, or is it snow in the winter?
Well, we do get our fair share of snow, although because I can remember Howdy Doody the first time on TV, so I have recollections of the big snows of the 50s and 60s, but we don't see those too often. We had some pretty big ones back in the 90s, and about every 5 to 7 years we have a real crowd pleaser, as I like to call them, but we don't see them as often as we used to. Now, again, because of the microclimate west of us, west of Frostburg, Maryland, it's a whole different world. There they always say they have 2 seasons, July 4th and winter, and it's like that. They have snow as early as September, so it is really an incredible place where snow, of course, that's where our ski resorts are too.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that aspect, actually. I've been away from it down in the South like for 15, 16 years. So snow, we had one instance of snow, and it was about a half an inch to an inch in Savannah back last January, and people went absolutely ballistic. So I laughed at that coming from up north. I said, that's nothing. People are going about their business like it's nothing with a half an inch of snow. So
we are looking forward to the winter, and of course with this heat, everybody's talking about when's it going to get cool again. So sooner or later it will be. Yep. And by the way, we promise next time we do the broadcast, we're going to get a better IFB. We're sort of joined at the hip here with this one.
Right. I saw you. That's 6 months ago. It's funny. I'm sure people will say, when's it going to warm up? And now here we are, and now wondering when it's going to cool down. That is Scott Sumner on the left. That is Lou Scally on the right. Next time you're up in Hagerstown, check them out in the Mid-Atlantic up in Maryland. So guess what? It is almost 8:30, and that's going to do it for us tonight. So thank you for joining us on tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, we will be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. I actually counted it up earlier this week. I think we have 20 more weeks, maybe 26, until the season is over. But thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh. I'm Wes Hohenstein.